China is now one of the world's most powerful countries. That was only 40 years ago, though. Over 90% of people in this country lived in poverty. The country was unhappy because of poverty and hunger. But in the next 30 years, the poor, starving country went through such a big change that it has reached this point. China's share of the world's GDP in 1978 was only 2%. China now makes up more than 18% of the world's GDP. China has the world's second-largest economy, and less than 1% of its people live in poverty. It's a lot of things that make it a powerful country. How on earth was that possible? What kind of magic did they use? Let's do a full case study on China in this movie. The Culture Revolution in China was coming to an end as one of the poorest countries in the world. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping had an idea, one that would turn communist China on its head. Since then, China has made enormous strides in various fields. So how did one of the world's poorest countries become a global superpower in just 4 decades? China is named after the Chinese word qin. It is written as Qin, but pronounced as Qin. Qin was the name of an old dynasty that ruled China 2,000 years ago and unified China. This is why we refer to Chinese people as Chinese in Hindi. What came from Qin is Chinese. And another interesting fact here is about the actual Chinese, the Hindi name for white refined sugar. It is believed that refined white sugar was brought to India by a Chinese man. Chinese man either opened a sugar mill or somehow sugar came from the Chinese route. Before that, we used unrefined sugar and jaggery. Because a Chinese person brought sugar, we started calling the sugar Chinese. Another interesting fact here is that Chinese people do not refer to their country as China. They use the name Zhongguo. For their country, it means the Middle Kingdom. It symbolizes China's 4,000 years old history, how China used to be the center of the world. It was in the middle. As you can see on the map, China is the world's 4th largest country. It borders India. But most of the Chinese population actually lives quite far from India on the east coast. This is because the fertile land on which agriculture is possible is mostly situated in that area. In the west, there are the Himalayan mountains and deserts. Because of its size, China used to be a very successful and powerful kingdom until the 19th century. And after that, it was affected by colonialism. Although the British could not fully occupy China as they did on the Indian subcontinent. But still, China was still looted in different ways. This is the reason why the period from 1839 to 1949 is remembered as the century of humiliation by the Chinese. It started in 1839 when the British East India Company began exporting opium to China. Opium is a drug to which many Chinese people got heavily addicted, and the entire Chinese society was destroyed. After this, many treaties were forced upon China, pursuant to which China had to hand over significant portions of land and its ports to the British. Then, in 1850, there was a terrible civil war in China called the Taiping Rebellion. Millions of people were killed. Fast forward 40 years, and you see the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. China and Japan went to war over territory. I won't go into the details, but the Qing dynasty was ruling China at that time. Don't confuse it with the Qin dynasty, the root of the name, China. The Qin dynasty is 2,000 years old. This was the Qing dynasty. The other was the Qin dynasty. Same pronunciation. From 1937 to 1945, Chinese people had to endure even more terrible torture, this time at the hands of Japanese colonizers. In the World War II video, I explained how China was part of the Allied powers. It was fighting against Japan. In World War II, around 30 million Chinese were killed. In the midst of all this, a ray of hope was seen when China and the Allied forces finally won World War II. Japan retreated. But right after the end of WOT, a civil war broke out in China, a war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, KMT. It started in 1927, but when Japan invaded during World War II, they had stopped fighting temporarily. The Civil War ended in 1949 with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. The people of the Nationalist Party fled to a nearby island, which is now called Taiwan. The mainland China was ruled by Mao Zedong. This was the point where it can be said that China was formed as the country we now know. 1st October 1949, the People's Republic of China was born. The leader of the Communists and the hero of the revolution is Mao Zedong. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward campaign. The goal was to bring about economic as well as social change in the country. This was mostly about two rules. First, to take land from people who own it and give it to farmers. Moving land around, following that, collecting crops. Together, these farming groups can work the same land and make more food. For the most part, though, the land belonged to the government. The second thing is development. On the one hand, big factories were built to make steel. The other option is to tell people to build small steel mills in their yards so that steel can be made locally. Everyone meant well, to make the country's economy better. It turned out badly, though. The steel that people made in the small furnaces they built in their fields wasn't very good. The resources were lost because of this. The farmers also didn't have any reason to increase their output because they didn't get to keep any of the profits or own the land privately. The land belonged to the government in the end. So, whatever the farmers were growing, the government had to be given it. This made people much less productive. From 1958 to 1961, it took 15% less time to grow grains. Things got so bad so quickly that the whole country was starving. This was caused by bad weather and other masterstroke policies of the Mao government. 20 to 40 million people died in China during this terrible famine. It's known as one of the worst famines ever. Mao Zedong was, in a word, a tyrant. Plus, dictators often force their will on people without thinking or trying it, first because there are no checks and balances for them like there are in a democracy. This kind of thing Mao did made China worse in many ways. The sparrow extermination was another bad choice like this. Mao wanted to make more food in the world. That's why all the birds and sparrows were told to be killed because they ate the grains. They eat some field-grown grains. All the birds in the country were to be killed because they were hurting the crops. A few years after this campaign to kill sparrows, people learned that the bugs and other pests were spreading so quickly that they were hurting the crops more. This made the lack of food even worse. A scientist later found that no one would be left to eat those bugs if all the birds were killed. When birds ate insects, the number of insects in the area stayed low. The whole order of nature was upset, and things got so much worse that there was a famine. The Chinese people and the Communist Party both said bad things about Mao after such a big loss. But Mao Zedong didn't want to accept he was wrong. There was a new effort. In 1966, there was the Cultural Revolution. It sounds like the name means it was going to be a cultural change in the country, but the real goal was to give Mao power and silence the opposition. A lot of propaganda and public relations tools were used here. Mao swam in the Yangtze River to show how strong he was. There is a well-known picture of him. The students, called the Red Guards, make up a citizen army. Red Guards were Mao's loyal troops. They wore red armbands and carried a small red book written by Mao. To find people who were against Mao was their job. Intellectuals, party leaders, and anyone else who didn't agree with Mao's ideas were singled out and made fun of in public. Often, they were also physically harmed. In the Communist Party, there were people who said bad things about the Cultural Revolution, and Mao and the Red Guards went after them. The Red Guards went after high-level party leaders like Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping. For the sake of this change, the whole country became very scared. People were told to spy on their family members and friends. Traitors were people who didn't agree with Mao's ideas, and people had to find them and report them. Universities and schools were closed. The students were told to visit farms and find out how the farmers live, to understand how hard life is in the country. Things got out of hand as time went on. The Red Guards began fighting with each other. Cultural and historical places were destroyed. The lives of many people were turned upside down. That's when Tibetans were also being abused. Finally, Mao saw that the Cultural Revolution had made things worse in China. It made the country split up, so in 1968, the Red Guard system was thrown out in order to get back in charge. Estimates vary a lot from source to source, but the Cultural Revolution is thought to have killed between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Up to 50 million people are said to have died in China because of Mao's rules. Mao Zedong died in 1976 because he was very sick. And then, China's situation hadn't gotten much better. But it's not true that Mao's rule was full of mistakes and bad things. There were also some good things that happened. For example, when it comes to women's rights and schooling. During Mao's rule, a public school system was set up across the whole country. There were campaigns by the government to get rid of ignorance. China's learning rate went up a lot while Mao was in charge. China had 3 times as many elementary and secondary schools in 1978 as it did in 1949. A strong base was built at the same time, which helped China help millions of people get out of poverty. What happened next? The story will show you that his government put a lot of money into education, especially in STEM areas like science, technology, engineering, and math. This helped get talented people into the country, which led to technological growth in the country. Software engineering and data science are now important skills that can change your life. When it came to women, Mao said, "Women hold up half the sky." In 1950, a new marriage law was passed that made it illegal all over the country to plan or force marriages. In many ways, women were put on the same level as men, like being able to get a divorce. But let's go back to 1976. After Mao's death, China got a new head for the Chinese Communist Party. His name was Deng Xiaoping. People also call him the father of modern China because it was under his rule that China really started to change. During Mao's rule, Deng Xiaoping was one of those who spoke out against him. During the Cultural Revolution, he had to quit all of his jobs because of this one thing. No doubt about it, Deng Xiaoping's ideas were very different from Mao's. Deng thought that the Chinese government had a lot of power over the business, which led to the destruction of China over the 5 decades before. He wants the economy to get better. That's why he came up with his economic liberalization plans. This has a lot of parts that we will talk about one by one. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is the name of his main idea today. To start, Deng changed the way farming worked by putting in place a system of family responsibility. Private farming stopped altogether when Mao started his Great Leap Forward movement. No one could own land on their own. For the most part, the local government owned everything. Deng did not change the way these things are owned. This property was still owned by the village government. However, the land was leased to farmers and their families for a long time. It will be up to those farms to choose what crops to grow, how to run their business, and where to make money. They were then given more freedom to grow any foods they wanted. Next, Deng said that every farmer would have to give the government a certain amount of their goods. Once they hit their quota, though, they can sell the extra food anywhere they want and make more money. This made the farmers want to come up with new ideas. They were more productive. India got its independence, and after that, states like Kerala and West Bengal made changes to the way land was used. These changes are said to be a big part of why states like Kerala have been able to grow so much. But these changes were not the same in every way. We can talk about them in a different film. When it came to companies, Deng Xiaoping used the same idea. This is when the factory manager responsibility system came out. Before this, when Mao was in charge, it was up to members of the Communist Party to run China's companies. A lot of politics got in the way. But when Deng took over, the workers and management in the factories were made responsible for it. They gave them more freedom to choose what they wanted to make, how much they wanted to make, how much they would charge for their goods, and how much they would be paid. The people who worked in the workplace were given another reason to work harder. Just imagine that there is a plant that makes things like shoes. Workers and managers in the plant can now choose how many shoes to make, what materials to use, how much to charge for them, and how much to pay their employees. The workers felt like they owned the business, and being responsible. They were in charge of the business and could make it work if they wanted to. A lot of planning was done in one place when Mao was in charge, someone sitting on top telling everything what to do, how things should work. Nothing was up to the government. Every event or thing that did not happen. Not so under Deng's rule when power was spread out. There was more freedom in terms of money. Many millions of people got out of poverty and their lives started to change because of these policies. In China, agricultural output grew at an average rate of 7.4% per year from 1978 to 1984. Between the late 1970s and mid-1980s, China doubled the amount of grain it produced. Changing the way people are taught was the next big step. To pay attention to teaching people. So, in 1986, the government passed a law that made schooling mandatory. Kids in China have to go to school for 9 years, and it's free. Take a look at India. India finally passed the Right to Education Act after a long time, in 2009. Besides that, China did not stop moving after the law was made. For a long time, the government spent more on people's schooling. In 1980, China's government spent about 2% of its GDP on schooling. And it kept going up. It got to 4.1% of GDP in 2010. Take a look at India. Our government has spent 2.9% of the Indian GDP on education, according to the most recent number. Plus, China has also put a lot of effort into technical and vocational schooling. People learned the skills that are needed for real jobs. Hey friends, if you saw my video from Singapore, You might think that these movements sound like they've been done before. Friends, it is. Every developed country has put a lot of effort into schooling. They've grown because schooling was given so much importance. It's amazing how much the rate of learning in China went up. Because of all of these steps, it was 65% in 1982 and went over 95% in 2012. India, on the other hand, still has a 77% literacy rate. Spending money on healthcare is also a strong sign. China spent 5.59% of its GDP on healthcare in 2021. Also, India spent about 2.96% of its GDP in 2020. Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs, were Deng Xiaoping's next plan for growth. The joint model of India is a lot like this in a lot of ways. In India, cooperatives are usually owned by the people who work in them. TVEs, on the other hand, are owned by smaller towns and villages. The goal of both is to improve people's lives and bring economic growth to rural places. There are a lot of unions in India, like Amul, that work in agriculture and dairy, but in China there are TVEs in almost every industry. Electronics, textiles, and services. One company that does this really well is Huawei Technologies. This business began as a TVE in the Shenzhen area. These days, though, it's a world leader in telecoms gear. These things can also be seen in the city of Wenzhou in China. Some people in the area set up small workshops to make shoes here. It slowly grew, and grew so big that the shoes made in Wenzhou are now a big part of China's exports. People in China and other countries buy the shoes that are made here. Around 100 million people worked for TVE in China by the early 1990s. People's standard of living began to rise. There is usually a difference in income between rural and urban places. That being said, TVEs have helped close this income gap. In the 1990s, TVEs made up about 20% of all the goods that China made in industry. There are now millions of jobs because of this. That said, this could only happen if people knew how to do all of this. Deng set up special economic zones in China in 1980. In these areas, tax breaks were given. In order for foreign business to come into the country, the government made it easier to do things and put in place fewer rules. This is often the first thing that people say when they talk about how China has grown. But I'm going to talk about this point later because China had to take many other steps to get to this point and successfully bring in foreign funding. The company from another country wants to invest in the country, but they need skilled workers. No one will put money into people who aren't trained and skilled. It was cheap to hire people here, they were skilled, there wasn't much red tape, and because of TVEs, people already had the training they needed. An SEZ was made in Shenzhen, which was China's first. In just a few years, this city grew from a small fishing village to a big international hub. Shenzhen had a GDP of $3.3 billion in 1980. It got to $420 billion by 2020. An open-door strategy was made to get foreign companies to come to the country. The world could do business with China. This is called opening up the economy. In 1978, it was done in China. India didn't start to open up its economy until 1991. Our country is going through a phase of change. Our country can't start a certain economic or agricultural revolution, or it can't join the world economy in a way that lets us take advantage of the chances that come up. As a result, many multinational businesses, including Nike, Apple, and Volkswagen, set up factories in China. China's FDI was only $0.6 billion in 1980, but it rose to over $333 billion in 2021. Apart from all this, the government also focused on infrastructure development. Railway lines were built, good public transport in cities. Along with this, the government made scientific research a priority. The Deng introduced a crash training program for more than 800,000 Chinese researchers. Priority areas were made: energy production, computers, optics, space technology, physics, and genetics. These science research centers were given heavy funding by the government. The money spent on research and development was gradually increased by the government, and in 2020, it crossed $500 billion. A big example of this is the Zhongguancun Science Park in Beijing, built in 1988. It is a hub of technology and innovation. Many high-tech companies, research institutions, and universities are situated here. In 1990, India and China were almost on the same line.